Hello and welcome to Media Monitor on the SABC News Channel, independent and impartial. This is where we take a look inside the world of media, analysing the trends, the issues and the reporting of some of the week's top stories. I'm Ndoro and this is what's coming up on the show today. Reporters Without Borders, RSF, has released its yearly Press Freedom Index, which states that South African media is somewhat free, but sadly, on a continent that's the most dangerous for journalists, Africa. We head to Nigeria, to West Africa, to discuss how journalism is being taught in this West African nation. We speak to one academic who suggests that things need to change. And our regular feature, Back in News History, takes us back to the 24th of April 1993. And that's when South Africa lost one of its founding fathers of democracy. Do you remember who that was? Find out a little bit later on in the program. We also have our regular feature, newspaper review, as we take a look at some of the front page stories. Remember, you can also engage with us on the program via social media using our Twitter handle, which is hashtag SABC Media Monitor. We look forward to hearing from you. Okay, now, before we get into those highlighted stories on the program, let's first take a look at what's on the front pages of the Sunday newspapers. And I'm going to start with the Sunday Times because this interesting piece, Nadim Tet, was on the front page of the Sunday Times, and the Sunday Times is reporting in its lead story that the Sports Minister, Nadim Tetwa, is signalling a seismic shake-up of sport in South Africa after years of paying lip service. He's come out guns blazing, apparently, at Cricket South Africa in particular, accusing cricket bosses of destroying the sport and reducing the game to a shadow of its former self. That's the Sunday Times. And then let's take a look at the next paper, which is the City Press. And the City Press is leading with the story of former President Jacob Zuma's architect, Ndoro Makhanya, who is facing a High Court case for his role in the Nkandla upgrades matter, but says that he cannot afford the legal fees. The man behind the 246 million rand taxpayer-funded upgrades at the former president's residence is pleading poverty, saying that he cannot even afford lawyers to defend attempts by the SIU to recoup money from him. The Sunday Independent, its lead story is says that President Cyril Ramaphosa allegedly manipulated Gauteng Judge President Dunstan Mlambo regarding the handling of a court case involving former State Security Agency Director General Arthur Fraser. This to save the career of Inspector General of Intelligence Dr. Dintwe in 2018. The paper says that it has seen an affidavit deposed by Fraser 2 weeks ago, alleging President Ramaphosa engaged in an irregular process that manipulated the legal process of South Africa. The Sunday Tribune is reporting another blow for the Zulu royal family, saying that the regent Queen Monarch, Queen Madlamini Zulu, is reportedly not well and was admitted to hospital on Wednesday. The paper says the hospitalization comes in the midst of a division in the royal family over who should be her advisor. The Weekend Argus on Sunday is leading with a story that suggests that one of the firefighting heroes that combated the Table Mountain blaze recently is among 500 firefighters in the Western Cape who are in a protracted battle with the city and possibly facing dismissal. This apparently after disciplinary procedures were instituted earlier this month, 2 years after a dispute over working hours. And finally, the Sunday World has the headline, Zondo circles human Zuma's house. This refers to State Capture Commission investigators wanting to know how former President Jacob Zuma ended up living in his upmarket Johannesburg home after he had been fired by the then President Tambo. The global COVID-19 pandemic has led to increased repression and attacks on journalism worldwide. A report published on Tuesday by Reporters Without Borders, or RSF, concluded, and reporting on coronavirus developments has been restricted in countries across the globe. Some countries have also seen government use the crisis to tighten their grip on the media, whilst others, including Germany, have experienced increases in attacks on journalists. Now, the increase in attacks is reflected in a 13% deterioration in the index's violations indicator for the sub-Saharan Africa region in the past year. And Africa sadly remains the world's most dangerous continent for journalists in 2021. And that's according, as I said, to RSF data. Reporters Without Borders recorded 3 times as many arrests and attacks on journalists in sub-Saharan Africa between 15 March and 15 May 2020, as it did in the same period in 2019. South Africa, though, is ranked 32nd on the index, 1 notch above the United Kingdom. Can you believe it? That's great news for us. Well, for more on this, I'm now pleased to be joined by City Press Editor-in-Chief Mondli Makhanya and Abidjan-based news correspondent Leanne de Bassompierre. Let's start with Leanne in Abidjan. Leanne, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Always good to have you on the program. When you look at this index, and particularly the rankings that Africa has got, has it come as a surprise? You've been at this game a long time, so you've seen many things. What are your thoughts?
It doesn't come as a surprise at all, Peter. We've seen in the last few years, particularly many journalists, as the report by RSF shows, that they've come under increasing attack, many more arrests, but also, as what you've experienced recently, a lot of cyber bullying, cyber attacks in recent years, particularly also against women. So I think this is a very, very worrying trend that we're seeing. A year in West Africa, I remember very clearly around the presidential elections in Ivory Coast in October last year. Many of my colleagues, both international and local colleagues, were threatened online for their reporting, not just by ordinary citizens, but also by political parties, telling them what line they should be taking, what angles they should be taking on their stories. Particularly worrying, I thought as well, in this specific report, is that they make the point that the average number of sources has dropped to 1.3 per story from just over 2, or at least 2. And I think in West Africa specifically, we have this issue of per diem. So I think it makes, it's really a threat to press freedom, because as newsrooms are becoming smaller, we have fewer resources. We are relying on these per diems or payments for, not particularly for stories, but, it's seen as a way to pay for transport or pay for any other things that you may have come across in trying to report on the story. But of course, it doesn't make the story equal and balanced. So if you're just having 1.3, an average of 1.3 sources per story, that is a very, very worrying trend. And I'm seeing that more and more in West Africa, where we have this ingrained system of per diem for reporters covering stories.
All right, we'll get into a few of those countries, particularly in your region, in a short while. But let's come home with Mondli Makhanya. Mondli, your thoughts on the overall index and Africa in general. I mean, it's not a great reading, but I suppose in some countries in particular, it didn't come as a surprise.
Yeah, definitely, as Leanne says, it didn't come as a surprise at all. I mean, there is still a very huge underappreciation of the need for media freedom on our continent. And sometimes you take one step forward and then 2 steps back. And I think that it's still a huge battle that has to be fought on this continent. But I think what we have experienced over the past year, not just on the continent, but in the world in general, is that many governments have used the cover of COVID regulations to basically basically launch incursions into freedoms that people enjoy, whether it's human rights, whether it's just basic rights. and in particular media and access to information. And that has been a lot more acute on our continent than it has been elsewhere. I think the instinct basically to curb freedoms has been much greater. Yeah, it's allowed some governments basically, and in countries where the elections were being held. I mean, like we saw what happened in Uganda, and again, COVID regulations were used basically by Museveni to manipulate the elections. So I think that coming out of this period, we have to be actually very alert to the fact that that governments who generally always like to grab more power will use disasters, states of disaster, and pandemics such as this one to basically to curb freedoms, as I said, and to manipulate democracy. So it's something that we actually, as human rights groups and as civil society as a whole, have to actually now think very strongly about how to protect society from these kinds of incursions into freedom.
Do you think, though, that it is, we actually looking at it as if things have gotten worse, but I wonder if things weren't always this bad, and that these governments are resorting to what they've always done. It's just that social media makes it more public now. We're more aware, but I mean, the country I know well, Zimbabwe, it took forever to even get independent media. And one independent newspaper was blown up, do you know what I mean? So those things didn't get wide reach, wide knowledge. And I wonder if it isn't just a question of they just do what they used to do, but they get reported more on it.
No, you're right. I think it's a lot of what used to happen. But, we did have a spring in the early 90s, sometime in the 90s and towards the early 2000s. And I think there was a move towards greater freedoms on our continent. There was a blossoming of democracy, a blossoming of rights. But sadly, what we have found in recent times is that it has actually reversed. I think what both you and Leanne referred to, I think social media, in as much as it has been an enabler of freedoms, it has been an enabler of the spread of the ease of the ability to spread news. I think, but it has also been an impediment in that it has led to cyberbullying. It has led to people to shut down voices. It has led to manipulation of information. In this country, for instance, there are groups, and in particular, one opposition party that loves to dress in red, which basically does a lot of cyberbullying of journalists, and which has actually done a lot to try and crush voices which are in opposition to it. I mean, like, it's not only the AFF. I mean, like, some sections of the ANC actually do this. Excuse me. Some sections of the ANC do the same. So, and I think it's going to become a greater challenge for media freedom as we go forward, because it's not just state actors and it's not just the conventional ways of fighting media freedom. And people are now using these tools that should enable greater flow of information to actually crush information.
All right, we'll explore some of the nuanced pressures in South Africa just now, but let's go back to West Africa. Leanne, I guess, there's parts of West Africa that have got militancy problems, and I wonder if even that has filtered into journalists fearing for their lives and doing the work that they do.
Definitely. Obviously, there's this growing threat of terrorism in this part of Africa. It's also a very difficult place to cover. So, often reporters in this region, now that a lot of newsrooms are becoming smaller, have less resources. So being able to travel to some of these remote parts of West Africa is becoming more and more difficult. And I think that is also an impediment to press freedom as well. And so I think it's both dangerous, it's both expensive, and so journalists being able to report on what's happening in this region is becoming even more difficult. It's already an underreported part of the continent, part of the world, and I think increasingly it's going to become more and more difficult. But I just want to say, actually, so Ivory Coast lists 66 on the Press Freedom Index. But I actually found quite interestingly, in covering COVID and the information around COVID, the government, I thought, I've been here for 4 years, was more and more open than they've been before that, in fact. So it's very rare to be able to, easily, I know from my experience in being in South Africa, you can very easily speak to spokespeople. They are allowed to speak on the record. They're very easily accessible via WhatsApp, via phone. And it's not always the case in Ivory Coast and other countries that I cover in West Africa. But around COVID specifically, they had a daily press conference which journalists could either cover in person or online. And then you could ask whatever questions around the virus, around the government's response to it, around the economy and how it had been battered by that. And of course now it's become a weekly press conference, but I thought that was a step in the right direction in Ivory Coast, at least, where there was a willingness to share information, which I hadn't seen in other parts of the country. And even in South Africa, where I know many of my colleagues, they had, not found that it was that easy to get information. Even when the president was having press conferences, there was no Q&A to kind of interrogate what decisions had been taken.
Do you sense that there is more and more critique and critical commentary in the newspapers, or is it less about government and authority in general? Across the continent, generally, you can write what you want as long as it's not negative about the government and the police and the army, etc.
Yeah, especially in countries in this region where the army is still very, very powerful, military is very, very powerful. So as soon as you start to go into that territory, it does become quite dangerous. I referred earlier to per diem, so I'm finding that across this region, even to cover weekly cabinet meetings, governments here are paying reporters per diems to be able to cover that, which already makes their stories not very balanced if they're being paid to cover something as basic as a weekly cabinet meeting. This is, of course, a part of a broad issue about journalists not being paid enough and media houses not having the resources, etc. But it does mean that they're going to be less critical, even if they're just getting a little bit of money or lunch for covering a specific story, government-related.
All right. Mondli, let's come back home, because you started something which was quite interesting, and you talked about how sometimes political influence can cause supporters to take on reporters based on what's being said by some of the political heads. I want to ask you as well about other pressures, because a journalist feels unsafe sometimes at the hands of his own paper or his own news agency. If you're being told you can't report on something, you're not going to, because you could lose your job. I mean, that is a threat, isn't it?
Yeah. Before I answer you directly on that one, I just want to also just appreciate, because South Africa is very much a good news story when it comes to media freedom. The fact that we are at number 32 above some of the kind of like most developed countries in the world and countries that are regarded as like advanced democracies. I think it's a further in the cap. And I think that it is the fact that the constitutional framework is very strong, civil society is very strong, and I think there's been an appreciation in the country generally of the role that the media plays. And I think we must appreciate the fact that we can still very much do what we do without the fear of going to jail, without the fear of being shot, and being driven into exile and so on. So I think it is a positive that we South Africans must actually be proud of at this particular point. But that having been said, there are those pressures, and those pressures are actually more informal pressures rather than formal pressures applied by government. Like, for instance, the hostile environment that's created by political players towards journalists. And sometimes journalists go into communities. And because political players have said negative things, communities, sometimes have seen communities stone journalists, stone cars, and journalists have to run out of certain communities. We've seen sometimes the police behaving very negatively towards journalists. There were cases in the past year or so where journalists have actually find themselves in the firing line of the police while covering protests. And then there's obviously there's resources. I think that's probably the biggest threat to journalism in South Africa right now, because newsrooms have shrunk so immensely that we are unable to tell the full story. A 100-kilometer a story 100 or 200 kilometers away from the big cities, it's become a lot more difficult to cover. And those are stories that need to be told on behalf of the populations that we are serving.
Yeah.
When it comes to bosses, when it comes to owners actually instructing journalists what to do, I think that is very, very minimal in South Africa. There is one particular newspaper group, which I will not name because they are rival newspaper that I work for, where the owner actually does something like he's effectively the editor-in-chief of that particular newspaper group, and it's been very disturbing. But on the other hand, we've had like the SABC used to operate in that way, where the boss actually used to be the government via previous administrations of the SABC actually used to be very interfering. But I think what the SABC has had an amazing turnaround in the past couple of years. May not be a financial turnaround, but in terms of the ability to breathe, the ability of the journalists to do what they want to do, to practice journalism. And I think the SABC actually kind of like has to be said, is the highly positive story of the past few years on the continent, where you actually, where an organization that used to be regarded as a state broadcaster is now actually doing the work of a public broadcaster.
Yeah, I can certainly attest to that. There's a different day for sure. Mondli, we're going to chat to you again a little bit later on as we take a closer look at the front pages of the South African newspapers. But thanks for joining us for this conversation for the time being. So we'll be chatting to him again a little bit later on. Leanne, perhaps let me finish with you. Idriss Deby passed away this past week, and I'm curious how this story was told, because he was pretty strong, wasn't he, in terms of managing his country. And it would be interesting to know how the media covered his death.
It was an interesting... Hello?
Yes, Leanne? Carry on, Leanne.
So it was an interesting, it's been interesting seeing how the media have covered, sorry, I just have some interference coming through at the same time. So it's been interesting to see how the media has covered Idriss Deby's death, both internationally and locally. For many Chadians, he's the only leader that they've known. So even though they've not necessarily, or the younger generation has not necessarily appreciated him in recent years, he is the only leader that they've known, having been in power for 30 years. So I think in this region, he was fairly well respected and appreciated, so that did come through in how they covered his death. But I think what was more important for this region is the impact that what happened in Chad has on West Africa and the fight against terrorism. He was a key ally of France, and how that will continue going forward. And of course, the French President Emmanuel Macron being at his funeral. It was also interesting to see which other African leaders were there as well, and seeing what kind of support there will be for France and this fight against terrorism in West and Central Africa.
Now, an article detailing how changes in the journalism profession have made journalism education challenging was published this week. According to the write-up, the growth of the internet has given everyone the ability to generate and distribute information. This includes news material, photographs shared across public platforms without any professional or editorial scrutiny. As a result of this democratization, journalists are struggling to adapt to this new reality where they compete daily with a larger society that has blurred the lines between creators and consumers of news. Now, constant changes in the profession have raised interest in the quality and relevance of journalism education. In these times, university journalism education is becoming increasingly important in shaping journalism practice. Every year, there are more people who take on journalism armed with formal education and degrees. Well, I'm now joined by the author of this article, a media and communications researcher and lecturer at Kogi State University, Nathan Oguchue Emmanuel. Thank you so much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Peter.
Howdy, buddy.
Good morning. Fine, thank you. Good morning, Peter.
Good. All right. So what inspired you to write this article? There must have been things that you were seeing that concerned you.
Yes. You see, this article is just anchored on my PhD thesis, which I executed in 2018 at the Department of Mass Communication, University of Nigeria, Nsukka. And basically, the idea came from the fact that when I was invited for a job interview after my NYC, that is the National Youth Service Corps, which is a compulsory service in Nigeria here that all graduates must undergo, before they join the labor market. I was invited for a job interview in Lagos, and during the interview, it was a media job interview. Other people from other disciplines were equally invited, and I was so perplexed because I thought that the field should just be exclusive, for journalism, those with background in journalism and mass communication. But to my surprise, people from other disciplines were equally invited for the same job interview. People with geography background, people with degree in English language and theater art. I was angry because I thought it should be a field that should be controlled by those who have degree in mass communication. But at the end of the interview, what even made me more angry is the fact that some of my own colleagues who study mass communication could not secure the job. So I started asking myself questions. Is it that journalism education, journalism training institutions are not adequately preparing journalism students for the challenges in the newsroom? So as a result of this, I came up with a topic for my thesis, and the topic was approved. So the article that was published by the Conversation Africa was just a component of that research effort.
All right. So what is the problem with the current education that our journalism students are taking? Is it just that they're not keeping up with what's happening in the world?
You see, the problem is a very complex one because, one, you see, the industry is radically dynamic. That is the media industry. But if you look at the university is highly conservative. So most of the time you will discover that university are very, very conservative in trying to keep up with the pace of in the industry. So these are some of the basic problems.
All right. So how do we fix it? How do we change the education, and what would it look like if changed?
You see, with what is happening, if university education, I mean, in terms of journalism, if they do not reinvent the way journalism is taught and learned, time will come that parents will begin to ask questions about the value in the formal journalism training. Because, I mean, if you undergo training and the training is not able to give you adequate preparation, to meet up with the challenges of the newsroom upon your graduation, it's going to be difficult because people, after a while, will begin to say, I mean, after spending money to undergo the training, I am not getting value for what I have paid for. So it is a big problem. If we do not check it, put it to check, time will come that people will not want to study journalism.
What do you think that journalists get taught at journalism school that's useful? I worked for an institution where 70% of the people in my newsroom had degrees in something else. But what it did was it gave a whole depth of experience and knowledge that was able to be applied in the telling of news stories. So I'm an accountant by training, for example. So when a business story came up, I was able to contribute to that. Another person studied history. He could give a context to some of the stories. So I just wonder if just doing the journalism channel is the way to go. And if so, what is it that's being taught that needs to change in particular?
Yes, this is part of the aberration we are talking about. It is an aberration because, I mean, if you want to, if you look at other disciplines like law, if you look at other disciplines like medicine, you see that before you can practice, you must have the basic knowledge. But we are saying that for us to move forward, for journalism education to take its place in the contemporary society, we have to reinvent. And how do we go about it? I think there has to be better collaboration between the industry and journalism training institution. That is one. Secondly, there has to be a kind of, those who are practicing have to be admitted into the classroom so that they can share their experiences with the students. So when we are able to put some of these things in place, there's going to be improvement, and journalism will definitely take its place in the affairs of journalism practice. And secondly, in addition to that, there is also a need to improve the facilities in our tertiary institutions, because these are some of the issues. You cannot give what you do not have. If you are undergoing broadcast training, you should be able to have some hand-on experiences in terms of skills development, in terms of your participation, so that when you graduate, you are not going in, you are graduating into a familiar terrain, but a situation whereby what we have in our training institution is just a caricature of what is obtainable in the industry. So some of these things need to be fixed.
You mentioned something quite interesting in your article, and that's the blurring of journalism and content creators and journalists. Talk to me a little bit more about that, and how can we get people to start critically assessing what is journalism and what isn't?
Good. Thank you very much for this question. You see, internet has revolutionized journalism practice, and this has opened up the space for everybody to participate in information distribution. And you see, because of the opportunity created by the internet, you see, everybody now everybody has the opportunity to make their contribution to global debate, to national debate. But for me, that is not enough. And it is not enough because it is not everybody that knows the implication of what they share within the internet arena. You see, and that is why we are having a kind of gamut of misinformation, disinformation in this internet age. And some of these things also raised serious concern for the media practitioners. Yes, it is very difficult to differentiate between content produced by journalists and content produced by those that we call the citizen journalists. I mean, it is equally wrong as well to refer those who don't have the background of journalism to be called journalists, because these are just people who are passionate about information distribution. It is not right for us to call them journalists because they don't have the background, they don't have the knowledge of the ethics, they don't have professional affiliation. So these are some of the things that we need to address.
Welcome back. You're still watching Media Monitor on the SABC News Channel. Now, every week we try and highlight some of the issues that journalists across the continent are facing. As you've seen from the Reporters Without Borders Index, it's a pretty hard job being a journalist on the continent. Our first story there, on April 18, Judicial police in the southern city of Tamransat arrested Rabah Kareche, a correspondent for the daily privately owned newspaper Liberté, after he responded to a summons for questioning, according to news reports, and his statement by his employer. Now, a court hearing on Monday has said that authorities accuse the journalist of disseminating false news harmful to the public order. That was his crime. Now, undermining national security and unity, they said, and using an electronic account to disseminate information prone to causing segregation and hatred in society, according to those sources and local journalists. I mean, that is shocking, isn't it? I mean, that is quite a general accusation, general crime, and subject to abuse by the authorities. All right, so those are the kinds of things that journalists are facing. And as we were talking about Reporters Without Borders, that journalism space continually shrinking, particularly on our continent. Well, it's time now for us to go into our news archives. And today we take you back to the 24th of April, 1993, when Oliver Reginald Tambo died after suffering complications following a stroke. This is how the SABC covered the story.
Tributes are pouring in from around the world following the death of ANC National Chairman Oliver Tambo.
75-year-old Mr. Tambo died in Johannesburg early this morning after suffering a severe stroke. He was admitted to hospital yesterday for observation. The ANC held a special news conference in Johannesburg after hearing of his death. Estelle Pina compiled this report.
In his reaction to the death of Oliver Tambo, ANC President Nelson Mandela said he was disappointed but not bitter that Comrade OR, as he was fondly called in the organization, would not see his efforts to bring about democratic changes to South Africa come to fruition.
He was my brother. My comrade. My friend. And my colleague.
He said that during the 30 years he spent in prison, Oliver Tambo was the standard bearer of the organization, and his death closed a chapter in South Africa's history.
He was a father figure who not only kept the organization together at a very difficult time, but he succeeded in developing the organization to become the strongest political force in this country.
Mr. Mandela said Mr. Tambo's health broke down because he traveled extensively through the world to mobilize support for the struggle. Mr. Tambo never heeded warnings to slow down on account of his bad health and insisted on attending the vigil after the death of Chris Hani.
Sitting there that cold night must have affected his health. And then it must have been worsened by him being at the graveside.
When a man of the stature of Mr. Oliver Tambo passes away, a country has to pause and has to ask whether all his efforts, all his endeavors have been in vain. He had seen conflict, he had seen struggle, he had experienced exile, but he also had the fulfillment of returning to his country and to share in the makings of a new tomorrow.
Right, as we start wrapping things up on the programme, it's time for us to take a look at what's been on the front pages of our newspapers today. And I'm joined once again by City Press Editor-in-Chief, Mondli Makhanya. Mondli, great to have you back. All right, let's start with your paper. What's on your front page and why?
Yes, so the never-ending saga of Nkandla is on the front page. We report today that that the architect of the 246 million rand upgrades that Jacob Zuma did to his Nkandla residence so many years ago, but basically now he was in court this past weekend on Friday. This past week on Friday, in particular, to be specific, and he is pleading poverty. So the SAU basically wants him to pay back 155 million rands of what was during that particular period, because he was the principal agent, he was the project manager, and a lot of the contractors basically reported to him. So he has to pay back that money. And he is obviously now, he's pleading poverty. He says he doesn't even have money to pay for his own lawyers, and he's applying for legal aid. So he's come that far down. I specifically didn't mention his name because he happens to be a person called Makhanya.
I wanted to ask if some of that...
I didn't get any of that 155 million.
And the question that one asks when you hear these figures is, how do you get 150 million go through your bank account and then at some point within a few years plead poverty?
No, exactly. And that's the question that needs to be asked. And I think this court case is going to reveal a lot, hopefully, because now he will have to explain as to what exactly happened to all that money. Did it all go through him, or did it go to other people, or was it some kind of laundering that happened during that period? Because 155 million rand is a lot of money, and the 246 million rand spent on those upgrades actually was not justifiable, even if a palace was being built. As it turns out, that the work that was done on that residence was actually very shoddy and flimsy, and there is nothing to show for that 246 million rand.
All right. Shall we go straight to the Sunday World? Because in some ways it's kind of related, talking about Jacob Zuma's properties. What do you make of this story?
It's very interesting because, as we all remember, back in 2005, when Jacob Zuma was fired as deputy president by then President Tambo, and he had to move out of the official residence in Pretoria, the deputy president's residence. So, and then he was homeless during that period. And then suddenly he then shows up at a very luxurious property in Forest Town, one of the nice suburbs of Johannesburg. And it's always been a mystery as to how he got to live in that house. Whose house was it? Was it in his name? Was it in somebody else's name? And who was this benefactor who gave him this property? And this property, by the way, we'll also remember, is where that unfortunate incident that led to him appearing in a rape trial. That's the incident with Kwezi. It was in that particular house. So now the Zondo Commission now wants to get to the bottom of who and how that house came to be and who was the benefactor, and Zuma obviously will have to explain if he ever were to appear before the Zondo Commission.
Yeah. The number of explanations...
All the mysteries of our past unraveling.
Yeah, number of explanations seem to be piling up, don't they? Very briefly, Sunday Times, what grabbed your attention there?
So the Sunday Times, the lead story there is it's something that should be of great concern to all South Africans. I mean, and it is the crisis in cricket. Natim Tetra over the weekend, on Friday, basically invoked a clause, clause which basically enables him to disband the CSA and to recognize the CSA, Cricket South Africa, as the official governing body of cricket in this country. And what that means basically is that formal cricket basically ceases to exist as we know it, and the Proteas basically do not represent the country. And there are a series of tours that are due to happen, that are supposed to come up. And if cricket is not recognized as a national sport, I don't know, it is the biggest crisis. And I can see where the minister's coming from. It comes from a place of frustration because of the cricket authorities refusing to endorse the new memorandum of incorporation, which basically is supposed to bring in a new proper governance into cricket in this country. And so
Mondli,
and it is a crisis.
Mondli, we're going to have to leave it there, but I'm sure that this is something that people will be watching with great interest. But thanks so much for your contributions today. It's great talking to you. Have a great week, my brother.
Thank you. Enjoy your Sunday.
All right, okay, that's City Press Editor-in-Chief Mondli Makhanya there, taking us through the papers. And that's how we come to the end of today's programme. Thanks very much indeed for tuning in. Join us again next week for more of the same. In the meantime, listen, COVID-19 is still with us, so please abide by all the protocols, especially wearing a mask. So please put one on. Bye-bye.